Strategy at the Hudson Institute. After Mike talks about the book, we will hand it over to Patrick Malloy for comments. Patrick is a former 5-term commissioner of the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission. He also practices as a trade lawyer and political consultant to nonprofit groups interested in reforming U.S. trade and economic policies. He has also served as Assistant Secretary in the Clinton administration and in the Department of Commerce's International Trade Administration. After Pat's comments, we'll hear from Mr. Richard Davini, who is the Baccalaureate Professor of Strategy at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College. Richard has published 6 books. His most recent book is Strategic Capitalism, which takes the principles of strategy rather than economics and applies them to the competition between the United States and China for, quote, global economic hegemony. Fortune magazine has likened Richard to Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese master of strategic arts. So with that, let me turn it over to Michael, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Change the slides.
This will adjust the slides.
Thank you very much. I think I've been invited to speak this morning because the conclusion of this book, the last chapter, mentions Stephen, Patrick Malloy, and others affiliated in a positive way. I essentially adopt many of your recommendations. I thought this morning I would just very quickly go to the 12 recommendations in the last chapter. Many people in China have been told there's an anti-China group in America or in Washington. And so they always look for a book that's like that. But this isn't that book. This book advocates cooperation with China. It expresses a great deal of admiration and praise for Chinese strategy. It praises the Chinese economic strategy over the last 40 years. It expresses great admiration for the way the Chinese Communist Party has used Chinese history to become number 1 or number 2 in the world economically. It has a large number of footnotes and references to Chinese language materials that I have translated, and it shows that I've been ordered by the U.S. government almost over a 40-year period to maintain contact and friendly relations with the Chinese military and the Chinese intelligence services. So you couldn't be more pro-China. This book, however, is being seen by some people as criticism of China because of the subtitle. In fact, because of the whole title. The word 100-year has been criticized. It's not really 100 years, it's a 200-year marathon that starts in 1840, some people say. That's true. Number 2, there's nothing a secret strategy. How can that be? If it's in a book, it can't be secret. So that's criticism. Number 3, many people use the word plan instead of strategy. So they say Michael Pillsbury says there's a 100-year plan. No, it just says strategy, a way of thinking. Continuity. The 4th criticism is the word replace. Oh, no, China does not want to replace the United States. The United States is a hegemon, according to China. It's quite a ruthless power, uses force to intervene, sometimes acts as the world policeman, and it has no virtue, according to China. It doesn't have nearly as much virtue as China does. So China will not replace the United States. There's a headline in one newspaper called 中国会称霸. China will become a hegemon, using this word ba that I'm going to come back to. So that word replace is controversial. And then global, no. Many Chinese say, no, we don't even think globally. That's not true. You can't use the word global superpower. We at most want to get along with our neighbors as best we can, Patrick. And finally, the word superpower. The word power, some Chinese find offensive. Again, it's back to this concept of a replacing or becoming a hegemon or a new world leader. So I've noticed a lot of columns in China now say this book title is not good. But then when the readers get into the content of the book, what do they find out? First of all, there's a long description of something in chapter 2 called the Warring States period, are often known as the spring and autumn period. The Americans I have worked with on China believe that communist China begins roughly either in 1921 when the Communist Party is created, or in 1840 when the Opium War starts China's century of humiliation. But actually the Chinese military and Chinese strategic thinkers in general draw lessons, I assert in this book, largely from the spring and autumn and warring states period, which is important for economic competition because why? Mercantilism becomes the main strategy of China, of the winning Chinese states during spring and autumn and warring states. Westerners think mercantilism is invented in Europe. The idea of keeping your currency, having your goal of your king, of your state power, to be having the greatest foreign reserve currency in the world. No, this occurs frequently among winners in the spring-autumn warring states period. So if mercantilism, what today Patrick would call in his public testimony currency manipulation, or other kinds of mercantilist policies, if they're invented by Europe, then perhaps China could easily give them up. But if they're invented by China 2,500 years ago, perhaps it's a much stronger way of strategic thinking than we have given credit. The other lessons the Chinese draw from the warring states and spring and autumn periods, it's all one 500-year block. It has two names, spring, autumn, and warring states, depending on what happens. The other lesson they draw is how countries rise and fall. What we call it the rise and fall of empires. In the first spring-autumn period, there are 5 hegemons that in sequence rise and fall. And a number of Chinese books describe lessons from the rise or the fall of the 5 hegemons. And I describe these lessons as quite relevant today. The Chinese thinkers themselves draw these lessons in these books about the rise and fall of the 5 hegemons. There's been another set of studies just in the last 10 years of the rise and fall of great powers, of empires, the Dutch, the Spanish, the British. Sometimes they throw in the Soviet Union. And similar lessons are drawn from those experiences. One of the lessons, besides mercantilism, one of the lessons is the need to induce complacency in the old hegemon as you're rising. In other words, from Chinese strategy, seen as a concept, what's the worst thing you can do? The worst thing you can do is alert your opponent that you're a competitor and that you have the ambition, or let's just say the hope, to replace him. So if that axiom from China's past is being used by the Chinese leadership today, it means that concern with the so-called China threat theory is far more serious to the Chinese than we might think. We Americans might laugh off, oh, there's no China threat theory. Everybody I know wants to cooperate with China. But if you're a Chinese leader and this is inculcated in you, then you must pay special attention to any sign that any foreign power, especially the #1 hegemon of the time, has been alerted. And so we find the number of proverbs, the most commonly known now, Tao Guang Yang Hui, to bide your time and avoid provocations, let's say. We find the number of measures being taken to be sure the Americans do not think in a competitive way with China. And actually, when you think about it, it's quite easy to find those Americans, and find those ideas, and then to deal with them. So you will find a large number of Chinese publications and Chinese individuals who actually are quite articulate in knowing what is the China threat theory and having ways to put it down. If I'm right, and these individuals are deployed carefully, if the China threat theory is monitored, then there's an interesting opportunity that I discuss in the final chapter, that when China pushes too far, for lack of a better phrase, its leaders will be sensitive to push back. And then they'll be willing to adjust their strategy. But they will have a very sophisticated means of measuring how much pushback there is. If I'm also right, this will be done at the very top. We find some materials that refer to the #3 person in the Politburo Standing Committee as being charged with this process. This is all discussed in a chapter I call the message police. One of my arguments is we greatly underestimate the sophistication of the Chinese leaders in monitoring opinions and individuals who think differently about China and then taking actions about them. There's a rather long section on some examples of this. And it relates to a third part of Chinese spring-autumn or warring state strategy, which I refer to as their study of the American model. Remember I mentioned the rise and fall of the 5 hegemons in spring-autumn, the rise and fall of 6 or 7 empires. There's another set of studies that I reference in here and translate some materials from, which is how China can learn from the American model. Now you might think, which I did at first, this means the last 10 or 20 years of the American model. No. The Chinese view in their scholarly books about the American model is based on roughly 1820. That's when it starts, 1820 to 1840. And it extends on up to World War I. In that period, the useful lessons China sees are the way the American government, not the American, this is very important. If you look at American studies of this period, you see American companies doing things, individual Americans. So Carnegie and names of sort of household names we all know, Rockefeller, they founded these empires, they generated wealth, somehow it gets taxed and the American government becomes strong. No, the Chinese version of that is the American government took the lead. First of all, in determining opportunities for market share. And the American government picked out a large number of steps it could take and then pursued them over a 100-year period. And I cite some examples in here from some of the more interesting Chinese books. One of these courses on how to learn this is taught at the Central Committee Party School in Beijing, which actually has translated copies of some American economic histories that show this process at work. It also involved technology theft. American companies, assisted by their government, the Chinese claim, stole technology from Europe to give it to companies. So I think you can see where I'm going. A number of components of Chinese economic strategy today that we might think are something that's been casually adopted by China, and which the Chinese government will deny. If you say, do you have a deliberate policy here in Beijing at your standing committee of doing any one of these things? If I'm right about the warring states and spring-autumn periods, the Chinese government will say, no, we do not have such a policy. A related example would be non-proliferation behavior. Beginning back in the late 80s, our government would ask the Chinese, we just saw this piece of equipment arrive in Iran or North Korea. It's really very unhelpful to the international community. This is happening. Do you know anything about this? It appears your government is doing this. The Chinese said, no, we're not doing that. Please show us what it is. If it's a Chinese rogue company, we'll work together with you and stop it. So all these policies I'm outlining to you that China denies pursuing seem to have a historical root, but will be denied by the Chinese government. So then what is the American government going to do? Anyone who stridently criticizes any of these policies, if my message police chapter is correct, is going to be demonized, marginalized, and others who say the Chinese government is telling the truth, this is all just an accident, that group will be treated with great benefits, shall we say, by China. This has been argued before in a book by Eamon Fingleton, who describes think tank by think tank in Washington and New York and the various newspapers, who takes which kind of stand about China, and then what happens. You almost never see a footnote to Eamon Fingleton's books. So the 12 recommendations are not military, even though I've been with the Defense Department off and on a long time. I don't advocate any military steps in this book. Ironically, and the Chinese government seems to know this, ironically, the Defense Department is the department of government that seems to most correctly understand China and to be taking action about it. The other departments of government I raise in my policy recommendations chapter are still functioning on the basis of some instructions that are declassified in the appendix to the book and on the website of the book. One of the instructions is 1984, President Ronald Reagan signed a 3-page National Security Decision Directive saying the American government's goal is a strong China. That's never been rescinded. So in various ways, all government departments, this began with President Jimmy Carter and the recognition of China, all government departments have a program with either a joint commission or some kind of formal framework to help China. So a strong China, a prosperous China, sometimes another adjective will be used, stable China, is the assignment of every American cabinet secretary since 1980. This is one of my recommendations is, if we're going to know how we're doing competitively with China, which of course itself would be attacked. No one should be talking about competing with China. Only cooperation is the preferred policy. But if there is going to be some competition with China, wouldn't it be nice to know an inventory of what we have done to help China, department by department? There's a large series of reports by the National Science Foundation of all the wonderful things that have been done to transfer American scientific discoveries free to China through a large office in Beijing. There's no Chinese counterpart in Washington. And you can say, well, of course not. Our scientific discoveries are far superior to those of China, so there's no real need for reciprocity. But my point here is, if we don't have an inventory, not only do we not know how well we're doing, we also can't bring to the attention of the Chinese leadership what I devote a whole chapter to. The description, the false narrative about the United States that is taught in Chinese schools under the instructions of the Ministry of Education. And I translated a few of these books because I think American readers are not familiar with the story. The story is that Abraham Lincoln was the first mastermind to contain China. Yes, this is discussed in several books. The American containment of China policy began in the 1840s when we assisted the British in the Opium War. There's a number of museum exhibits that explain this in southern China. It's not true. You can look in our books. No, the American military does not help the British military. A few American opium smugglers are sort of standing around. But it's not the policy of the American president to help the British sell opium in China. That's how it's taught. You can fast forward. One of the worst stories is we have quite a liberal, famous president in Woodrow Wilson. Tries to have the League of Nations, tries to found a whole doctrine called Wilsonianism today. The Chinese demonize him. He's one of the core myths of the Chinese Communist Party, is that the American President Wilson at the Versailles Conference gave Japan a piece of China, the Qingdao area and around Shandong. This then sparks a movement in downtown Beijing, where there's a huge museum today, the so-called May 4th movement. And it's another example. If you go into China's largest museum in Beijing, in fact, it's the largest museum in the world, bigger than the Louvre, bigger than the Met, bigger than the British Museum. In that museum, there's an exhibit called Fuxing Zhilu, the Renaissance, the Road to Rejuvenation, is the official translation. And it shows a map of the American forces in Beijing, Patrick, and how they occupied a certain zone of Beijing. There's not one example in this huge, huge museum of American assistance to or support for the rise of China. In fact, it's the opposite. The Americans are portrayed as either the worst of the foreign powers who humiliate China, or certainly one of them. The only pro-American exhibit in the whole area is a picture of Deng Xiaoping in a cowboy hat in a rodeo in Texas. And the book that goes with the exhibit explains to you, Deng Xiaoping was a great leader because he obtained American science and technology, especially during his trip to the U.S. In the rodeo hat, he's actually going also to Houston to see our space program, which we've been very generous in sharing with China. So I'm trying to create for you what it's like to be a young Chinese going to school. Yes, you can come to America. You can go to MIT physics department. But what you're taught before you go, and also with Communist Party materials when you get back, is the demonization of America in its government intentions toward China. I recommend that this become better known and that part of our government dialogue with China be very simple. The Chinese have already led the way. Remember I said I expressed admiration for Chinese strategy? They show the Japanese repeatedly in government meetings things that are wrong in Japanese textbooks. It's an international bilateral issue of the highest order between Tokyo and Beijing. We've never brought up the Chinese textbooks about us. You'd think that would be a simple measure, but actually I think not. I think you will find those I characterized earlier as wanting cooperation only with China will oppose it. They'll say, no, this will only create friction, it's unnecessary, and besides, these particular examples are not, somebody will say, the mainstream. Then we'd have to have a huge effort to try to survey all Chinese textbooks and what they say about America, and that would be counterproductive, Patrick, to U.S. China relations. So I won't give you all 12 recommendations in the final chapter, but one of the things they have in common is you can sort them into two groups. One group of recommendations is to have America be more competitive with China. But to do that, we'd have to know quite a bit more about the competitive situation than we do now. And part of that also is to say that those who work on competition now, if you're at USTR or you're filing cases at the WTO, at the Justice Department, you're a pretty lonely person, if my book is right. You are not a mainstream American China policy maker. You're basically a troublemaker, you're not appreciated, and you're not getting with the flow of history, which has been to help China become a strong power. The second part of so there's very little chance of the competitiveness side of American strategy awakening. I put the chances quite low. There's no national competitiveness report. I recommend there should be one. Congress should be asking the White House for an annual or biannual national competitiveness report. How are we doing as a country? You can find various aspects of the report scattered around the government. The National Science Foundation has its indicators. But I actually asked two secretaries of commerce, do you have this kind of report? The answer was no. I've thought about getting it, but we don't have it. And secondly, you'd have to know better what the Chinese competitiveness strategy is that we're, in some sense, working to do better against. So all of that, I put the chances very low. We would much rather, and I have a quote here from, I think it's from Innovation Economics, we'd much rather, as Americans, fight each other. Our left wants to fight over, this is as close as I can recall the quote, our left wants to fight over inequality. So our right wants to fight over Chinese military threats, the sort of ex-casino aircraft carrier steaming around. So one of my recommendations is, why don't we have a coalition where people concerned about China or competitiveness or human rights or several other issues would all actually cooperate? But I put the chances of this as close to zero, Patrick. We'd rather fight each other than compete against the number 2 or number 1 economy in the world. And finally, I'll conclude the other set of recommendations, which takes up quite a bit of the final chapter and is scattered throughout the book. The other set of recommendations says we Americans have a much stronger interest in the reform of China than we might realize. We might think we have so many other issues to worry about. ISIS beheadings, the collapse of Yemen. Will Iran go nuclear? Should we attend the speech of the Israeli Prime Minister? So it's very nebulous and hard to focus on what kind of China would we like to see. I have a chapter called 2049, and I lay out what an unreformed China would look like in 2049. Just project trends ahead. You can assume 7% growth rate. Frankly, you can assume 6% growth rate. If the United States grows at, say, 2.5 or between 2 and 3, and China's between 6 and 7, certain trends occur over the next 34 years. The Chinese say we're in year 65 of the current marathon. And I describe what that world will look like and how some people then, in 2049, will look back and say, why didn't you in 2015 take a greater interest in the reform of China? So that's a kind of a brief summation of the book's argument. Some of these slides, if we have like a couple minutes, I'm going to show you. I have to give this to you, Stephen. How would you turn to the second slide? Since you're here and I'm a visitor. This is from the museum wall. Okay, this next one. Okay. This is from the museum wall I mentioned in Beijing, the National Museum. It's a picture of the imperialists. You see the Chinese dragon sort of down here, chained, and the Russians, including the American eagle, out to hurt China. This is a good example of the portrayal of our neighboring powers to China. Next one. My last book was translated into Chinese and sold actually quite well in China, again because it gives Chinese a chance to see the debate going on among themselves. The New China News Agency published the book with a very long preface that this book is by a guy who's biased. He works in the American Pentagon, but we are publishing it for all cadres because we don't have such a book in China that shows the different points of view talking about the future. This was a series of 200 authors in China who debated among themselves where the world is going, and they had quite different schools of thought. Next one, please. Example of reform. Does everybody recognize this poor guy? He's the head of the Communist Party in 1989. Yes, the head of the Communist Party. You all know what happens to him? He gets put under house arrest for life. He writes a memoir that's smuggled out, and he says, I wish we had gone from multi-party democratic elections. In this particular case, he's going down to talk to the students at Tiananmen and saying, I'm sorry I came so late. He did not receive any communications or support, even Christmas cards or get well cards, from any American president his whole life under house arrest. So a Communist Party leader, I want to make sure everybody gets this, Communist Party leader who already is for reform. He has two key guys working for him, Ron Ming and Yan Jiechi. They're drafting reform plans inspired by James Madison and the separation of powers for China in the 80s. They're government employees. So democratic reforms have gone pretty far in China by the time the scene takes place. What happens is the hardliners scare and exaggerate what's happening to Deng Xiaoping. The students go to form an exile government in Paris. Does anybody from the United States help the exile government in Paris of all these students, including Yan Jiechi, the man who worked for Party Secretary Zhao? No, there's no. The Chinese government says these people are all being aided by CIA and helped somehow. No. And the exile government collapses. So the party secretary reformer is left alone under house arrest for 30 years. The exile government is not aided. The students scatter to the winds. They end up, after some media performances, they end up going to business school in some cases. So this moment of political reform in China is allowed to drop by the government's concern. Next slide, please. Let's skip this. If I translated what my book is about into Chinese, it would be called The China Dream. And I would associate myself with President Xi. I'd say President Xi's career as a reformer has already been shown. I support President Xi in his reforms, but I hope he goes a bit further than he's outlined so far. Next slide. this is we don't have time for all this. I'm going to give you the last couple slides. I want to give you an impression of President Xi, China Dream. This will be coming out in English next month, by the way. The Warring States, lessons. No, anyway, I guess we can't get to it. There's a picture of President Xi when he was 27 years old. He came to the Pentagon. He was the note taker for a military delegation. And he has benefited, I would say, he has watched the U.S. China cooperation since 1980, when this meeting took place. And I noticed in his new book, President Xi has a picture of himself. No, it's the last one, I think, when he's 27 years old. So I argue that the amount of cooperation between the U.S. and China has been excessive or unbalanced. There's been more cooperation than competition, and it's time to change that, to have a new way of thinking about China in which competition is at least half of the story. Thank you. That's the picture of President Xi.
All right, got it. Great. Thank you very much, Michael.
I was a note taker then.
Okay. So we'll go to Patrick Malloy, then Rich Diavini for comments, then I'll offer a few from ITIO's point of view, and we'll open up to questions.
Steve, you indicated I could have 8 to 10 minutes, so if I get to 9 minutes, let me know so I can wrap it up. I'm not a China scholar like Michael. I don't speak Chinese. I did study Far Eastern and China and communism as a graduate student before I realized I'd better go to law school. But I did have the good fortune of working at State, Justice, on a Senate Banking Committee. I was a political appointee at Commerce dealing with trade under President Clinton. But the best thing, I was 10 years as a commissioner on the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission. Let me tell you what that is. That was set up by the Congress in 2001 to monitor the economic and trade relationship with China in terms of national security interests of the United States. It's a bipartisan, bicameral commission. 3 are appointed by Majority Leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell. 3 are appointed by Harry Reid. 3 are appointed by Pelosi, and 3 are appointed by Boehner. Now, during my time on the commission, which was 10 years, we issued 9 reports. That's when I first got to know Mike. About 2001, I think we met Mike, and then we went to China together, I think in 2004. These reports have been almost everyone, 7 of them were unanimous. 2 of them were by votes of 11 to 1. So the idea is,
this high technology stuff. The idea is when you, I always say we're like the old Joe Friday and Dragnet. We're just out to get the facts. And then the facts, when you look at them, begin to tell you a story. So I want to tell you what I see going on here. I first went to China in 1982 when I was in the antitrust division at Justice. I was in Japan for work, but I had friends from Foreign Service, and they said, we can get you to go to China. I said, oh, go. I went to China. I saw a poverty-stricken country, but I liked the people. I went to Shanghai, Suzhou, and Beijing. And I remember going to Shanghai, and the students did tell me that there used to be signs down in the Bund area, no Chinese or dogs allowed, because they did get some pretty bad treatment. China used the term comprehensive national power, meaning you build your economic and industrial base, and upon that will come your political and military power. If you're growing your economy at 10% a year for 30 years, as the Chinese have done, they're down less than that now, but tie your military spending to the growth of your economy, you soon move up to a pretty good military budget as well as a very strong economy. And then you get a lot more political influence in the world. And they use that term. Now, another thing, you hear people talking about, gee, the American workers are the most productive workers in the world. Was it because we're hardworking, or are there other things going on? Productivity is based on the tools that you give a worker. If you're building a road using shovels, your productivity won't be as high as if you have technology given to your guys to use backhoes and other means of building roads. So one thing that Americans have had is we've had a very high technology base in this country. And my worry is that in our relationship with China, we're transferring a lot of that technology out of the country, and we're leaving our people with a less productive economy, and we're building the Chinese to have a more productive economy. China last year had a trade surplus with the United States of $340 billion. Since China joined the WTO in 2001, we've run over $3 trillion worth of trade deficits with China. China now has foreign currency reserves of over $4 trillion. So just contemplate that for a minute. Let me start with the point that Michael made, a little bit of history. You can't understand what's really going on here without understanding what happened to China, in my view. The Chinese were the premier civilization in Asia for thousands of years. And they considered their emperor kind of the supreme political authority. The Brits went to war with China in 1843 because they couldn't, the Chinese didn't want to buy British goods. The Brits wanted Chinese goods, so they found they could grow opium in India and sell it into China. And then they would get the exchange to get the Chinese goods. The Chinese said, we don't want all that opium coming here, and tried to block it. And the Brits went to war, and they took the Chinese apart because the West had better military technology. And then China did have a pretty bad time, what they call a century of humiliation. We won't go into all that, but we'll say when Mao came into power in 1949, he said, China has stood up, meaning we're not going to get pushed around anymore. We're back on our feet. We're going to stay on our feet. Now, he tried to build a centrally planned Soviet-modeled economy, and he failed. China did not grow its economy, and when he died, they had a GDP of about $200 billion. Now, Michael's point about this vision that the Chinese have, that's just not Michael. Let me tell you, there's a guy named David Lampton, who's over at Johns Hopkins University. And he's written a book about China, and he says, quote, listen to this, during the over 100 years of China's decline, the noted China scholar David Lampton had told us that the universal goal of Chinese people was to make China rich and powerful and regain the nation's former status as a great power that controls its own fate. You cannot be in China very long and talking with people, and you really get a sense they feel they were wronged, they want back, they want to assume their former place on top of the hierarchy. That's my impression. Now, the genius was Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping comes into power in 78. Mao's died in 76 as the struggle. Deng emerges, and he says, we can't grow our comprehensive national power unless we get foreign investment, foreign technology, foreign know-how, and foreign markets. And if we can do that, we can grow this economy. So the first thing he wanted was to get diplomatic relations with the United States, which we granted them in 1979, recognized the Chinese government, the Communist Party, as the legitimate government of all of China, and we gave them most favored nation trade treatment. What does that mean? The average tariff on a good coming from China before 1979, and not many came, would have been 44% or so. After we gave them MFN, the average tariff on a good coming from China would be about 4%. So if you're an American and then they incentivize American companies, joint ventures where you transfer technology to get here, and then we'll give you subsidies, free land, and all other cheap labor, low environmental standards. You come here and you can ship back, and you make more money for your companies, your stockholders, and your CEOs whose compensation is tied to shareholder value. So that was a pretty good strategy. Now, I remember being around during the WTO debate. That was bringing China into the WTO. Now, why did Congress get into that debate? Because we had a law on the books that we could not give a communist country MFN more than 1 year at a time. So that's why Congress got into the debate. They had to change that law because to bring China into WTO, we had to give them permanent MFN, PNTR. They changed from MFN to normal trade relations because people didn't like having to vote for most favored nation trade treatment for China. They preferred to vote for normal trade relations with China. So when China joined the WTO in 2001. Now the story given to the Congress was this is going to result in more exports to China. By that time we had an $83 billion trade deficit with China. Remember in '79 we had no trade deficit. By 2001 we have an $83 billion trade deficit. So the Wall Street Journal, I want to just read this to you. This is a Wall Street Journal article that appeared the day after the House voted to give China MFN trade agreement. This article says that the agreement, when the companies were lobbying Congress, they were talking about U.S. exports to China were going to increase. Here's the first line of this article, Wall Street Journal. Even before the vote was cast yesterday, in Congress's decision to permanently normalize U.S. trade with China, corporate America was making plans to revolutionize the way it does business in China. And while the debate in Washington focused mainly on the probable lift of U.S. exports, many U.S. multinationals had something different in mind. This deal is about investment, not exports. The Chinese they were always worried that we could take MFN away. If we got it locked in, the American companies would further increase their investments and technology transfer to China. The second thing that China wanted into that WTO, we used to have Section 301 of our trade laws that if a country would commit an unfair trade practice like currency manipulation or IPR theft, that we could unilaterally put sanctions on that country. Once China was in the WTO, we had to go through that whole WTO dispute settlement process, which takes years, and it's quite ineffective, to be honest with you, when you're dealing with a country that has an industrial strategy like China has. So after so many years of China now being in the WTO, our trade deficit with China went from $83 billion in 2001 to $340 billion last year. Now, what else is China doing? Well, they're saying to American companies, if you're in China and you want to be a friend of China and get better treatment, transfer your technology, put R&D here, then you'll get more favorable treatment. And our companies, maybe they don't want to do this, but if their competitor is doing it, then they're going to do it. So they pick off these companies one at a time and they end up transferring technology and R&D to get this kind of better treatment in China. The Chinese are massively stealing intellectual property. You remember John Huntsman? He was our former ambassador to China. He was involved in a report just last year, and he says national industrial policy goals in China encourage IP theft. An extraordinary number of Chinese business and government officials are engaged in this practice. Now, Huntsman, you can't say is a China hawk. I mean, he was our ambassador. He was well received over there. He's run for president in the Republican Party. But here's what he's saying. He's saying, yeah, this is really going on. What about currency manipulation? No doubt about it, this has been going on now for about 15 years. China underprices currency to gain a competitive advantage. It makes it more difficult for American companies to sell into China because the goods produced here are more expensive for the Chinese to buy, and it gives the Chinese goods an export subsidy to come into the U.S. market. Now, what about Congress? Do you know who, there's a guy named Ken Lieberthal. I remember Ken. He was on the NSC staff under President Clinton. He dealt with China. And he wrote a book about China and how to compete in China. It was called Managing the China Challenge. Now, here's what he said about how the Chinese work the Congress. This quote from his book, page 89. When Congress debates trade distorting legislation that targets China, it is not unusual for the Chinese government, through its embassy in Washington or other channels, to pressure multinational corporations to weigh in to prevent the legislation from passing. So we have now a whole group of American companies doing business in China, and the Chinese can squeeze those guys to come and lobby against legislation here that may benefit the larger American community, but may not benefit them and their shareholders, or the Chinese, so they will end up perhaps lobbying against things that we should do. For example, a bill that passed the House and the Senate says we're going to permit countervailing duties to be put on goods that receive an export subsidy from China through an underpriced currency. The House passed it 1 year, the Senate passed it another year, but all the multinationals, the U.S. China Business Council and others have lobbied against that legislation. I think we're hoping that it'll get passed this year. Are we up almost time? Okay. Okay, what is to be done? One of the key things I think we need to do here, we need to give our companies an antitrust defense, where when they're being squeezed by a foreign government to transfer technology, we should permit them to cooperate with one another and give them an antitrust defense. Because if they can pick off one, then there's a lot of pressure on the others to go along. So that's one thing I testified before the House last Thursday, and that's one thing I strongly emphasized. And there was some interest in this among members of the House. But I think we should, to be honest with you, the key thing I think we should do, we should set a national goal to balance our trade. Because if you can balance your trade, then the companies that are outsourcing are going to be more careful about outsourcing production instead of producing here. Because if you have to balance your trade, maybe you won't be able to get your goods back in. You understand? Because if you balance it, you can't just bring in, you got to export in order to balance your trade. I have a lot of other ideas, but I'll stop now, and I appreciate you listening to me.
Great, thanks, Pat. Well, Richard, if we can bring you into this conversation via Skype, if you can hear us.
I can.
Fantastic. We really just wanted someone from a climate that's had an even worse winter than we've had in Washington, D.C. to make us all feel a bit better. So I know you've been up in New Hampshire. So go ahead and take it away, please, for 8 minutes or so.
Okay, thank you. First, let me say I'm very honored to be on a panel with Mike and Pat. They know a lot more about China than I do and have a lot more experience in the government. I come from a different world. My job is as a consultant to very large corporation doing business in China and around the rest of the world. So I expect the other side. In addition to that, I also have, a fair amount of experience in essentially doing competitor analysis for companies and also industrial policy work with other countries like France and a couple of other places. So I'm coming at things from a different perspective. In general, I'm a strategist who believes that there are general principles of strategy that can be applied whether it's sports, militaries, corporate, nation states, or even capitalist systems. So I set out to look at what are the issues associated with the competition between the American capitalist system and the Chinese capitalist system, in which I looked at actions, not words, because one of the fundamental elements of competitor analysis is You don't believe any of the words because they usually don't represent what companies or organizations actually do. Even if they intend those words to come to fruition, the implementation process is always going to interfere with the achievement of the intention. So you look at actual actions and then impute and put together what you believe is an emergent strategy, not necessarily a planned strategy. Like Mike and his comments about no plan behind all of this in China, what you do is you look back at what is more of the competitive philosophy of a rival. And so I broke down capitalist systems into 4 different generic types, of which every government has some combination. A laissez-faire capitalism, kind of like what you hear from the University of Chicago, free markets, free trade, no regulation, market efficiency, always optimizing welfare. Second one is more of a type of capitalism that's based on philanthropy rather than on government taking care of lots of people, and that's kind of the George Bush Sr.'s 1,000 points of life and of light, and lots of action where philanthropy takes care of the poor after the rich have made all their money. This is kind of a Robert Barron era philosophy, and recently adopted again by Bill Gates and by Warren Buffett. Then there's social market capitalism, which is one where the government takes care of the people through taxation. And finally, managed capitalism, which is essentially the Chinese system, where the government is substantially intruding. And so, and creating competitive advantage for countries. So the analysis that I undertook was to try to get an idea of what's the proper mixture and of capitalisms. And what I discovered is that by looking at the actions of the Chinese government, that they were taking advantage of a couple of different aspects of the U.S. system. We're very strong on laissez-faire capitalism, and despite popular belief, to go and actually analyze it, we're also strong on social market capitalism because we've got very strong, now healthcare systems. President Obama, and prior to that, Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid, welfare programs, public housing. So social market capitalism we're very strong on. And if you look at the Chinese system, what they've done is they've used those characteristics against the United States. In a kind of Sun Tzu, use the weight of what made us great and turn it into what's going to undermine us. Flip that weight over so that it becomes our detriment. And so in terms of laissez-faire kinds of systems, they've really taken advantage of American capitalists seeking to make a profit. And let me give you some examples. It's not just IP theft and currency manipulation, where they basically undermined our notions of open markets and free trade, or with subsidies in which they've attacked certain industries and so forth. They've gone a step further with laissez-faire capitalism, and it didn't dawn on me until I had a conversation with somebody on the People's Consultative Congress in China, and they were telling me. I was asking them why some American companies did so well and others didn't, after he had mentioned how China would never allow American corporations or foreign corporations ever again to achieve the kind of influence over China that they had during the 19th century and the century really 8th. And his response to me was, well, some companies do better because we allow them to, and other companies don't. And in essence, we run a lottery system. We entice millions of corporations to come here by allowing 25 to win big. Basically like going to a casino in Las Vegas, Macau, actually. But the bottom line here is that when you start to realize they took the instincts of capitalists and started to get them a little pregnant in the system. And then when they got pregnant, they became subject to a kind of influence that they get out of. And what developed was, for a lot of corporations, what I call the China taboo. Behind the scenes, the American corporations would complain like crazy that they weren't getting a fair deal, but in public they were afraid to say otherwise. And they were afraid to say otherwise because of either the Chinese retaliation that they feared, or because of the stock market reaction. Because they had been taught the Chinese about the giant market opportunities, and the CEOs then took that information, brought it back to their shareholders and to Wall Street, and now if they started to say, well, the opportunity is not that big, their stock prices go down, their bonuses disappear, and so they're locked into a perpetual public position of saying that they have to, that China investment is a good one, while in private and in boardrooms they're saying, what are we going to do here? And studies done by the Chinese American Chamber of Commerce, Chinese European Chamber of Commerce show that on average, American businesses in China perform less well in terms of profitability and growth than they do in their home markets, even though they were enticed by this idea of massive growth and massive profits. So in essence, what I saw was a Chinese system that took advantage of laissez-faire and that also took advantage of American social market capitalism because of a lack of Chinese investment social benefits that we have. There is no really functioning pension system for Chinese, nor is there really a large-scale, modernized medical support system for Chinese citizens, and so forth and so on. So by sacrificing all of these social benefits, they were able to create competitive advantage. So the bottom line at the end of this was, my view is that the Chinese had outsmarted us, in essence, in terms of inventing a capitalist system that was better than what we had, and that they had achieved something which other managed capitalist economies were unable to achieve in the past, like the Soviets, like the French, like the Japanese. Their industrial policies or national centralized control systems didn't work as well as the Chinese, because the Chinese had essentially managed that process differently. They didn't over-centralize. The country was too big, so they couldn't reproduce what the Soviet system had done, and they were unaffected by political demands of labor unions and all sorts of other political interests we saw in democratized countries. So what I came to was that the Chinese system was actually superior to the system we had in the United States, that the Chinese should continue to do that rather than liberalize and become like the West. We were not going to be able to convert to Western-style capitalism. And finally, that the only way to deal with this would be to start using essentially the Chinese strategy against the Chinese. And that was to create a more, like Pat was talking about, a system of more cooperation and maybe even more government investment in things that might give us the future. Now, or might help us change the future and prevent Mike's 2059 scenario. Sure. So in conclusion, I'm going to stop with one last comment. So what I say we should do, a lot of the recommendations that come out of Washington now are to stop the currency manipulation, stop the IP theft, countervail duties and subsidies that are given by the Chinese, and to try to rebalance trade. I believe that all of those things are just trying to make them like us. We will never do that. They recognize their superiority in their system. They will not give up those things, and that this is not the right way for us to play the game. We need to use Sun Tzu kind of philosophy back against the Chinese. So we need to find what are the 3 or 4 most important elements of the Chinese success, and then turn those against them the way they turned our form of capitalism against ourselves. So let me give you just a couple of quick suggestions. The first thing is they have built, essentially rebuilt a version, a modern version of the British Empire in the 1800s. This is the model that they've worked off of, a mercantilist system with centralized manufacturing for the world and then export to the rich places in the world, which puts them at the central hub. So the key element of undermining the Chinese position is not to declare war, not to say all these bad things. We should just simply go about dismembering that activity. So where would I start?
And let me ask you to wrap it up in 1 minute, if you could, Rich.
Sure. So where would I start? The big place I would start is essentially with massive technology investment in 3D printing. Here is a process which essentially eliminates, or would eliminate, millions of jobs in the assembly process and in the manufacturing process in general, essentially obsoleting the core of the Chinese system. So basically, my book was all about, let's take and undermine whatever those centers of gravity are to the Chinese capitalist system, make them so that they become weight and use it against them. So breaking up the mercantilist system is another.
Okay. Well, Rich, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing those unique perspectives. Let me just take 1 minute to contribute IKEA's perspective. Michael, I very much enjoyed reading your book. I think that the central theme of the book, that China does in fact harbor a long-term strategy and ambition to supplant the United States as the world's leading economic and ultimately military power, and moreover to restore its position that it long held throughout most of recorded human history as the world's dominant economic, cultural, and military international force, is probably valid. But I don't think there's anything wrong with that. China is well within its rights, just as any other nation, whether the U.S., the United Kingdom, India, Japan, should be, in aspiring to be the best and in maximizing the quality of life and standard of living for its citizens. Just as any employee of an organization might wish to be CEO or an athlete to win a championship, an aspiration to be the best and to lead is completely valid. In fact, I hope, from an American perspective, that there's a strategy somewhere in the U.S. government, although I doubt it, to keep the United States as the world's leading power over the next 100 years ourselves. So we want China to get rich. The key question for the global system is how we create an environment in which China becomes rich while we stay rich and citizens throughout the rest of the world become so as well. I think in contrast to what Paul Krugman says, the reality is that nations do in fact compete with one another for economic leadership. And so I think it's important that we hew to many of the core concepts of the World Trade Organization that were designed to create the environment in which we all flourish. And so that's rejecting the notion of absolute advantage for nations for comparative advantage in which countries and their industries compete based upon genuine innovation and market competition for leadership, abiding by the principles of national treatment, non-discrimination, and fair competition. And so I think your final chapter of the book, which puts forward 12 recommendations for how the United States can both increase its competitive ability in the global economy and also push back in places where China may be using innovation mercantilist practices, is a good prescription that all policymakers should follow. I think your book makes an important contribution to scholarship on U.S. China economic and trade relations, and it should be widely read in Washington, D.C. and around the world. Michael, let me just ask if you'd like to respond to any of the comments that have been made by the panel panelists, and then we can open it up for audience questions.
I'd like to respond to something you just said, that there's nothing wrong with China doing all this as long as you hope, I'm trying to write this down, you hope somewhere in the U.S. government there's an effort to keep the United States as number one. But then you seem to be saying you're not quite sure there is such an effort. You hope that there would be, right? So does Patrick. Patrick has his list of ideas.
Just to get absolutely clear, I was saying that there's nothing wrong with China pursuing these goals as long as they are doing so within the context of the multilateral trading system.
I'm talking about the second part of your statement, okay? You hope that there's somewhere in the U.S. government, someone's trying to work on keeping America as number one. But you are not sure there is such a place,
that is true,
or that this is really happening. Then we have Patrick's testimony to the House of Representatives subcommittee last week recommending these ideas.
Yeah.
Then we have a brilliant academic study that, gee, China might be, pursuing all this as a conscious strategy. You'll notice what is different about my book, what I'm recommending, and what the three of you are saying. I am alleging there is no such unit. You need to get over this naive optimism. If there were such a unit, I would know about it. There isn't. No. There is not an effort in Congress to pass these various recommendations. I happen to agree with Patrick's recommendations, but by now, Patrick, we know for 20 years, there's no currency manipulation declaration by the Treasury Department. They can be banged on every year. They won't do it. Isn't the definition of insanity to keep trying to do the same thing and expect the same result? The categorization that China might be pursuing mercantilist strategies or industrial policy, that this might be the case, that would have been a wonderful insight 30 years ago. What the Pillsbury book is saying is there needs to be congressional legislation to demand a report from the president on American competitiveness. It's a very simple idea. If we can't get that passed in the next couple of years, it's going to tell us a lot about the instincts Americans have to maintain their number one status. Secondly, if we can't get the inventory done of what the U.S. government has been doing to help China without congressional authorization, Patrick, there's no law that says the U.S. government, each department, shall help China. I report in my book, this is what's been going on, including the Defense Department, including the CIA, carrying out old presidential directives that are still in force, that I cite in the book and that I put on the website. If we can't get an inventory of all that's been going on passed so that Congress and the public get some rough idea of what's been happening, it's quite important. There's a whole set of things that this book is perhaps one reason it was a bestseller when it first came out, the first week. #1 Washington Post, #1 LA Times, #7 nationwide, is a lot of people are saying, gee, this guy seems to be a government insider. More than 30 years in the government, and he's saying these things. Now, if we don't go further with some of these steps, we're all going to be here still, if we're alive, Patrick, in 2049, going, oh, gee, maybe China has an industrial policy. We should do something about it. So the time for action has arrived.
Well, thanks, Mike.
End of comment.
And you'll be happy to know that ITIP has already done a lot of the work for Congress with a report we wrote last year called 50 Ways to Leave Your Competitiveness Woes Behind, a national traded competitiveness sector. So the blueprint and outline is there. We're working on that.
How many votes? I was a
Why don't we open it up to...
I was a Senate staffer for more than 10 years. I know how to count votes. How many votes did your proposal get in the Senate? I think it hasn't even come to the floor.
Well, actually, there are components of it that we work on a daily basis. But with that, that's a fair point,
So
Mike. It's not far enough.
You're telling me everything's under control.
Not at all.
Don't worry. There's no need for this book because this is already underway. Okay, fine.
Why don't we go ahead and open up to the audience for questions? If you would, please just state your name and the organization you're with.
My name is Zhao Yingfeng. I'm the DC reporter of War Journal. My question is for Mr. Pillsbury. You mentioned the reform of China will be in the interests of America. I wonder whether you expect China will become a weaker state that no longer be competitive enough to be a threat of America, or it become stronger and more cooperative. And you also mentioned the strategy that China is pursuing can be traced back to thousands of years ago, and it's a deep-rooted way of thinking. With any kind of reforms, no matter political or economic, can have an impact, can change this way of thinking. And also, do you think America also has a similar strategy, like a deep-rooted way of thinking? Does America have a strategy like the one of China that you mentioned in the book? Thank you.
You sneak 3 questions into one. America does not have a similar strategy. China says America is pursuing a strategy. It's very interesting. If you read, as I have done and discuss in the book, the Chinese government tells the Chinese people America has a crafty and cunning strategy to 遏制而分裂而保卫我们中国. It's not true. I say it's not true. I would know. But it's very widespread in China that in 1999, the U.S. clever strategy under Bill Clinton was to send a B-2 bomber and put precision bombs into the Chinese embassy in Belgrade to send a message to China. And here I have the what used to be secret, the Politburo minutes had a meeting the next morning after this bomb went off. What should we do? You would think the Chinese leaders, Jiang Zemin, Li Peng, you would think they would say maybe this is an accident. President Clinton has already apologized. No, I put their quotations from the secret minutes of this Politburo meeting, standing committee meeting. They all saw it as a deliberate, cunning American test of Chinese determination. And they decided we need to take the following steps immediately. Demonstrations, some firebombs were thrown in Ambassador Sasser's residence. He was kept essentially a prisoner for 3 days in the embassy. All of this is a deliberate Chinese strategy against what they claim is the American strategy, to contain China and to kill people in the Chinese embassy in Belgrade with a B-2 bomber flown all the way from Missouri. There are many examples of this. Chinese claim that the U.S. is a crafty, cunning opponent out to block China. I'm arguing we have to make public these Chinese views, this demonization of our government. We have to ask China nicely, please don't say this anymore. This is not true. If you don't, if you keep saying this, we're going to punish you. The second question you're asking, well, I can't answer all 3 of your questions, but as a general rule, your readers should be reading 3 people about reform in China. China debates reform. The Standing Committee members, the 7 of them, they meet, they have discussions. How much reform should we pursue? A little bit or a lot? We know from the 1980s, from the writings of Mr. Ruan Ming, who lives in Taiwan now, he wrote a memoir. I hope your readers will, you'll quote from either the Chinese version or the English version of the Ruan Ming memoirs. he discusses the reforms debated in the 80s by the top leaders of China. Yan Jiechi, in his book that Andrew Nathan translated, or writes a foreword to, Yan Jiechi was also involved working directly for the Communist Party secretary about reforms. They had what today look like extreme reforms, national multi-party elections, being considered by the Politburo. Your readers today are not going to know about that unless you quote from those two books. The third book is by a guy who got the Nobel Peace Prize named Liu Xiaobo. He wrote a lot of material that's available in English about just how far Chinese nationalism has gone compared to 20 or 30 years ago. One reason Liu Xiaobo is in jail, not just Charter 08, but his writings, that China's culture is being changed drastically by the hawks in China over the last 20 years. Does your publication print anything written by Liu Xiaobo? I think not. I hope you do. So the limit of reform, it's some of the things Patrick Malloy has advocated, that ITIF has already done many reports on, but the level of reforms discussed back in the 80s, from 84 to 89 roughly, before Deng Lichun and Hu Qiaomu blocked everything with the spiritual pollution campaign. That's the level that readers of Chinese publications inside China should be thinking about today. Those weren't American ideas. Those were Chinese ideas. And President Xi is moving toward that to some degree. He's not an anti-reformer. But the public in China doesn't really know because these books are banned. In China, you cannot buy Ron Ming and Yan Jiechi or Liu Xiaobo. So I hope your readers will get some chance to get these quotations.
Any other questions from the audience?
Alan Wolf from McKenna Long and Aldridge. Great presentations, very thought-provoking. I'd ask you to autograph my Kindle, but I don't think that would be very effective. The direction Xi Jinping is going in, do you see any differences? I mean, there are debates in this country, programs around this town of where Xi Jinping is headed. Is it largely down the center of what's been happening as you describe it in the long term, or are there some differences? What's your prognosis?
My recommendation number 12, my last one, is to monitor and influence the debates on reform at the very top levels in China. And the difficulty with this, there are two difficulties with recommendation 12. Number one is these are secret debates. The Chinese don't have House Foreign Affairs subcommittee hearings where they take testimony and we can all read about it. They have extreme secrecy about the meetings of the Politburo. They don't release transcripts. So when I give you in here the transcript in 1999, it's kind of a big deal, but we don't have week by week accounts. That said, there are lots of clues. Chinese officials at the very top leak debates according to their political interests. So we can follow the Shanghai Free Trade Zone reforms debate. There's a number of debates we can follow. But my recommendation isn't just monitor the debates, it's to influence them. So what that would mean is, which is not happening yet, my recommendation is the U.S. President and cabinet secretaries and members of Congress could easily do this too. Quote from the debates as we understand them in public. For example, one of the debates going on right now, I mentioned some of the advocates. It's shall the Constitution in China be higher or the Communist Party be higher? To Americans, this is very strange. We wouldn't say the Democratic National Committee is above the Constitution. I mean, maybe there's someone, Patrick, who thinks that, but I think that would be unusual. We would see our Constitution as sacred, written in a kind of religious fashion, according to some people, and therefore the Constitution clearly prevails over political party behavior. We also put the military under the Constitution. In China, there have been two debates going on for several years now. One, and President Xi had to answer this. There's an interesting interview recently of President Xi. He was asked, which is more important, Constitution or party? You know what he said? He knows about the debate. He said they're both important, but the party's a little more important. It's a rough translation. So he's confirming to me there is such a discussion going on in China at the highest level. Has any American said anything about this, Patrick? No, it's totally unknown to the Congress and to the high-level commentary by our cabinet secretaries. I'm sure ITIF has a report on it, but I haven't read it yet. The second debate is the party and the army. Most countries in the world say the military comes under the civilian government. Not in China. The army protects the party. And the army, all the military, not just the army, Air Force, Navy, etc., are under the command of one political party. Now, Patrick, how would you like it if the Defense Department were under the command of the Republican National Committee? You wouldn't like it. So this is another debate we see all the time in the Chinese military press. Anyone who says that the party and the army are the same is wrong. We must not have a nationalized army or a national army without the political party. This is a very important debate. It happened in Taiwan, actually, but they did withdraw the Nationalist Party from the army. There are many of these debates going on in China. My proposal is not only should we passively pay attention, but we should expect members of Congress, members of the people running for president next year to be familiar with these debates. Alan Wolf should be able to tick off, yes, there are 5 major debates about reform going on in China today. Here's what they are, and this is the side I take in each of these 5 debates. But my criticism is this is totally unknown in our discourse about China policy and China strategy.
If I could just, I want to make a couple of last points. One, I agree. China's doing what it wants to do. Wants to be numero uno. That's fine. They should, but if they're doing it in violation of their WTO and IMF obligations, so they're benefiting from the low tariffs they get. Their goods coming here. They're stealing IPR. They're manipulating their currency and other things. So we should hold them to account. The second thing we have to do, we have to figure out how to incentivize our corporations to put our national interest first. The interest of the multinationals have diverged from the national interest. We can change that by our own strategy. Low taxes for companies that produce in the United States, provide good jobs for American citizens, and maybe higher taxes on companies that earn their profits producing abroad and shipping back here. I mean, there are a lot of things that we can do and think through a strategy. And that's what I'm saying. We can push the Chinese. They may not do what we want them to do, but we can control our own strategy, and that's what this country needs to do. Understand that we're under this competitive challenge, and think clearly and begin to put together a national strategy. Now, Mike's book is very important to get out there because he's laying out that there is a competitor out there who wants to be numero uno. And we should understand that and then put in place our own strategy to keep our American economy and a good job for Americans here.
Pat, I think we can say at least the panel agrees on that point. Yeah. So with that, I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank Rich for dialing in via Skype from New Hampshire. Mike and Pat, thank you very much.
Nice to see over 1,000 people.
There you go. When you have a chance.
Thank you all very much. My name is Larry. I'm in Larry, would you help me?